So today, first, are there any questions over stuff that we covered before Easter? All right, then today what we need to do is we need to talk about parental care and family conflicts. Somebody just chimed in. Still don't see Kennedy. Oh, there she is. All right. So I'm going to share my screen with you guys.
Chantel.
What's that?
Your name is showing up as Chantel.
Yeah, Mom's been using Zoom, so I don't know how to change it back.
Oh, okay. I was like, have you been lying this whole time?
No.
Daughter.
That's not a very common name. I knew a person growing up who was named Chantel.
Yeah, no, it's not very common, but it's I don't know, it's French for Charlotte, but
Oh, really?
yeah.
It's weird. I don't know that many Pauls actually, and I was commenting on it a couple of weeks ago, and then I was on my way back from the grocery store, and a guy rear-ended me and broke my bike rack on the back of my car, and it turns out his name is Paul also. So yeah, Chantel, very, very uncommon. All right, parental care and family conflicts. Hopefully you're not having too many family conflicts where you are right now, spending more time with your families than maybe you anticipated. But when we think about mating systems, reproductive choices of animals, there are conflicts between males and females in terms of what the relative costs and benefits are of particular behaviors, but this extends beyond just conflicts between a male and a female who might be mating. And so your book has an informative graphic there at the beginning of this chapter. You can have conflicts between parents, you can have conflicts among siblings, and you can also have conflicts between parents and offspring. And so this is the graphic that is in your book. And so you can think of female parents and male parents having different goals because of the way fitness accrues to males and females differently. So that's what we refer to as sexual conflict. That can be over mating decisions as well as participating in things like parental care, which is what a lot of this chapter talks about. Then, of course, you have parent-offspring conflicts. I mentioned this at the end of the last time we met. Offspring want to receive parental care as long as possible, while providing parental care may negatively affect the future fitness of either of the two parents. And then, of course, there might be sibling conflict, sibling rivalry. Do you guys remember from your first semester talking about the coots? Can anybody fill us in on what the coots are about?
Wasn't it like if they were darker red, they were more visible and got more food or something compared to
well,
the other?
we don't know if it was more visible or what the proximate cause was, but certainly the redder the head and the beak and everything, the more parental care you got, and that had influences on your growth rate, your survival rate. There were three variables that they measured. What were they? Growth rate, survival rate, oh, and number of feedings. So you got fed more, which means that you grew faster and you survived to fledgling better. And so this was parental favoritism, where parents were doling out different levels of parental care to offspring. There's also, of course, then the potential that offspring could compete for parental attention. And so within any family unit, there's potential for lots of conflicts. And this chapter, which seems like a fairly involved chapter to me, is about these different conflicts and how they get resolved. So the first thing you want to do is think about the parental care. So the chapter takes parental care, first of all, and think about what are the different types of parental care. What would these be? The obvious one is
2 parents,
2 parents. Okay, that's one obvious one. What's another one?
1 parent.
1 parent. What's the third type?
No parents.
No parents, yeah. So you can have no parental care. These parental care types tend to be distributed unevenly across different taxa. So for example, corals would be example of a group of organisms that exhibit no parental care. Corals just basically spray their gametes out into the water column in oceans. The sperm and egg get fertilized, the fertilization goes on in the water column, and then those propagules just drift away on the currents, essentially. In this case, parents are unable to protect young or provide care to young. And your book talks about this being a situation that favors R-selected life history traits. And on the board behind me, I've written for you to remind you of the density-dependent population growth model. When your book talks about R-selected and K-selected organisms, it basically comes from this model where the change in population given some change in time is determined by the intrinsic rate of increase, which is what R is, multiplied times the density of the organism, or the population size of the organism, and then that's all multiplied by a fraction that represents the proportion of carrying capacity that is taken up by these organisms. So when we think of R-selected species, we think of species that have undergone natural selection that has maximized growth rate. And so these will be species that tend to put out tons of offspring. Oftentimes those offspring are very small. Those offspring have a relatively low possibility of survival, but so many of them are produced that ends up not mattering that much. And these individuals tend to be, these species tend to be species that have relatively short lifespans. This is different than K-selected species, which tend to not be selected for high, fast growth rates, but tend to be selected for slower growth rates. They grow slowly to carrying capacity, and they have a set of life history characteristics that allow them to hover around carrying capacity for long periods of time. These species tend to produce fewer offspring. Those offspring are larger generally. Those offspring generally require more parental care, and these tend to be species that live longer and have longer generation times. And so when you see R-selected and K-selected, it's that dichotomy that the book is drawing, and the R and the K represent which parts of this equation the two species have kind of evolved to
Why is it called R
focus on.
select?
Oh, because it's selected for growth rate. So R is the intrinsic rate of increase, and the higher R is, generally the more offspring you have, and so the faster the population growth rate is. And so it's just, these are species that have undergone selection that tend to maximize growth rate, as opposed to not maximizing growth rate, which would be K-selected species.
And is that why they have smaller offspring?
Yeah, generally R-selected species will have lots of offspring, and because you have a finite pile of energy that you can invest in reproduction, you end up making those offspring small because you're trying to have a lot of them.
Did you say N just represents the population size here?
Yes, N just represents population size at a given time. Yep. So this is going back either to ecology, if you took ecology with Dr. Judd, or we also covered these in evolution and ecology during your first semester, all those many years ago.
Okay, one more before we move on.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So what does selection for carrying capacity mean? Like what case
So
select?
K-selected species are species that have undergone selection that tends to not maximize growth rate. As a result, these species tend to grow more slowly in terms of population growth. As a result, they approach carrying capacity more slowly, and then they tend to level off at carrying capacity. What happens with our selected species is, you guys have this down,
Uh-huh.
written down? Okay, because this is not in the PowerPoint. What tends to happen with our selected species is, and this is a situation with corals that occurs with a lot of insects or our selected species. As time passes from the past to the present, this is population size from very few individuals to a lot of individuals. Our selected species tend to go through periods of boom and bust. So our selected species tend to experience exponential growth. So they tend to grow in density independent sorts of ways where carrying capacity doesn't really act on them. So they tend to grow, they tend to outstrip resources, and then they crash, and then they go through another period of exponential growth and crash, go through another period of exponential growth and crash. They tend to have population cycles that go in these boom and bust sort of cycles. So Luke, there in Texas, I heard this year was a big year for crickets this past summer. Was this the case in your section of Texas?
Yeah, there were actually there were a lot of reports in the grass too. I do remember that.
Yeah, so I remember some years when I was growing up in Central Texas that there would be these years that the crickets would just be everywhere. And then you would not see them for another 7 or 10 or 15 years. And then all of a sudden there was a year and there were crickets everywhere. Like crickets so bad that you would like slip on the sidewalks because they were getting crushed under people's feet and the guts were all slimy and you would risk falling on sidewalks because of the slime. And so you tend to have populations that exist at low population size, and then when they increase very quickly. They outstrip their resources, and then you have a crash. It takes them a while to build up again, and they tend to do this sort of dynamic, as opposed to populations that exhibit density-dependent growth. Carrying capacity becomes a part of their growth. They grow slower, and as their density increases, their density begins to reduce their growth rate, and so they approach carrying capacity more slowly and tend to arrive at carrying capacity. And they may oscillate around carrying capacity, but they tend to not go through these huge swings of population booms followed by population busts. Does that help, Alexis?
Yes.
Okay. So you can have parental care. This might involve yolking eggs, nest building, provisioning, protecting young after hatching or birth. And as we talked, you can have parental care that is provided by either one parent or two parents. But one of the fundamental differences in investment is parental care generally is a much greater investment than obviously no parental care.
What is eggs?
What's that?
What is yolking eggs?
Oh, yolking eggs. So if you're a female and you're making eggs, there's a certain amount of energy that you put into eggs, and eggs vary greatly in size. Give me a minute. I didn't think about this, but I should have brought something to class today.
Does the yolk have like the nutrients essential for the embryo?
Yes. Yep.
No, okay.
Yeah. So the yolk is the yellow part of the egg. The albumin is the clear part of the egg. I'll be right back. you guys probably didn't realize this, but Williamsville College has a kind of extensive egg collection. This is an egg from a sooty tern. It's a ground dwelling, ground nesting shore bird. This is an egg from an ostrich. You're going to invest in this egg, or you're going to invest in this egg? Obviously, sooty terns are much smaller than ostriches are, so ostriches have more energy to put into eggs. But an ostrich could choose to produce one gigantic egg, or it could produce multiple smaller eggs. So to what degree do you invest a lot of energy in producing relatively few gigantic eggs versus a larger number of small eggs? These are going to produce smaller offspring, obviously. These come from a smaller bird. But in terms of relative investment, this is actually a pretty significant investment in reproduction for a sooty tern, because these are 4 eggs. That's a whole clutch of eggs. And that represents a significant amount of the body mass of the individual. So whatever energy they're putting into yolking eggs, making eggs, is energy that they can't put into growth and maintenance and survival to the next year.
Does the
So-
the embryo in the yolk?
What's that?
Like, is the embryo in the yolk?
No, the embryo grows on, for bird eggs, it grows on the surface of the yolk. So birds, let's see. Have any of you taken Dr. Vora's developmental biology class?
Yes.
Did he talk about different egg types in that class? He might not, because he's a different kind of developmental biologist.
We opted only to talk about humans, really. We
Okay,
talked
all right.
about the urchin eggs, actually. But
Okay, so there are different kinds of eggs. So there are isolecithal, mesolecithal, and telolecithal eggs. And these refer to how well distributed the yolk is throughout the egg. And so your typical bird egg, ostrich egg, it has an eggshell, and it has a well-organized yolk mass. And then there's all this albumin, all this clear albumin around it. This is a classic telolecithal egg. Human beings have an egg that is more on the isolecithal to mesolecithal, such that the egg is really mostly just yolk. And in isolecithal eggs, you tend to get full cleavage all the way through the egg, all the way through the zygote. So after fertilization, I'm going to drop this and break it, and I'm going to hate myself. After fertilization, when the zygote goes through the first cell division, isolecithal eggs tend to be cleaved all the way through the first cell, and then they go through really even divisions at the beginning, at the early beginning of development. Mesolecithal have eggs that look to the eye like the yolk is fairly evenly distributed, but what happens in these, when you look at them more carefully, is there's an uneven distribution of the nutrients in the egg. And so the first cell division after fertilization tends to go only partway through the egg, and then the next division that you see is offset from the center, because more of the yolk is at one end of the egg than at the other end of the egg. And then telolecithal eggs are like a chicken egg, where you have the eggshell, you have the yolk. And what tends to happen in telolecithal cells is all of the cell division happens in a little plate of cells at the very top of the yolk. And as the embryo grows, the embryo will grow out and slowly envelop the yolk. And so different forms of development happen depending on the type of egg that you have.
So
And
a
that probably-
frog egg would be mesolecithal.
A frog egg would be mesolecithal, yes. Frog eggs are a classic example of that. Alexis, was that way more information than you were looking for?
I mean, it's kind of useful because now I know how chickens are grown. So that's
Yeah.
cool.
Yeah, so let me get out of this for
I guess I kind of just always assumed that the yolk just kind of turned into the chicken.
yeah, it's more involved than that. So back in the old days when I took developmental biology, it was called embryology. And do I still have my book? Yeah, I don't think I do. I think it's up in the lab. Anyway, one of the things that we had to do when I was an undergraduate in my embryology class is we had our box of chick slides, and after the chick is developed, it's growing up on this, it's kind of floating on the surface of this yolk that it's consuming as it grows, and it eventually just kind of flops over. And if I could get out of my, yeah. So after a time period, the embryo, the chick embryo, is growing on this plate of cells on the surface of the yolk, and it just kind of it's kind of growing up on the surface, and then it can't support itself anymore. It just kind of flops over on its side, and at that point you can start to see the development of the eyes and the brain. You can see the heart beating. You can see the vertebral development, and we had serial sections of our embryos that looked basically like this, and this is a section through this embryo, and so you can see head structures and you can see tail structures as well. So this thing is kind of hooked around. This is the head, this is the tail, and this is the heart dividing into its different chambers, et cetera, et cetera. We would have these long serial sections. So we would have one chick embryo that was sliced into lots of different slices with a microtome, and we would go back and forth on these slides that were all on a single slide right next to one another, or in some cases for the really far advanced ones, they were on multiple slides. And we would follow the parts through the body as you scrolled back and forth with your stage micrometer. And so this was the way we taught developmental biology back in the old days, before the advent of cellular and molecular biology. So here's a picture of an embryo, and this is the disc. They call it the vegetal disc that it is growing on. And you can see that it's sending out blood vessels that are basically taking nutrients from the yolk, bringing it to the embryo, and then also dispensing of waste and storing them in the outer portions of the egg. And this one is starting to develop eyes and growing into a little chicken. And sometimes you'll be at a store, especially if you ever get farm eggs. So this is showing the different stages from really early development to later development to even later development. And you see here, it's still laying flat on the surface. Here it has grown up enough that it's kind of flopped over on its side. If you get natural eggs, like eggs from a farm, you will sometimes crack open an egg and you'll see that it was actually a fertile egg, and you'll be able to see the embryo with your naked eye growing floating on the surface of the egg. So once again, probably way more information than you were actually looking for. So Provisioning. Provisioning. Keep in mind that even though an ostrich has this gigantic egg, its sperm are probably not much bigger than a human's. So once again, this initial investment difference between males and females is crucial in thinking about what happens with future investment decisions as well. So one of the fundamental things to ask is who provides parental care? Does the female provide parental care? In many cases, if anybody is going to provide parental care, it's going to be the female. Why?
They gave
Because
birth.
they invested in the egg and or the embryo for a long time before it was born / hatched.
This is my head right next to this egg. If you've invested this much in an egg, chances are you're going to be pretty interested in continuing to invest in that egg. This happens in most mammals. Why would most mammals have female-only parental care?
Because the females are the one with the mammary glands that produce the milk for the young.
Okay, so mammalian offspring are fed initially by the female, not by the male. Why else?
Because the female carry the offspring for some period of time, and that's an investment.
The females gestate the offspring. That's not only an investment, but it's also, what does it prevent females from doing?
Having more offspring.
It prevents them from having more offspring.
Aren't the males reproducing? Like they're continuing to reproduce, so they don't.
Yeah, males can get up and leave. Females can't get up and leave. They're saddled with the offspring because it's actually growing inside of them. So they're physically attached to that offspring for whatever the gestation period is, not even thinking about the provisioning of that offspring after it's born. So mammalian females are much more closely tied to the offspring because they carry it. They can't desert the offspring because the offspring is actually being gestated inside of them. And then they're the only one of the two sexes in mammals, they're the only one that is capable of provisioning the offspring when they're very young. So that's why most mammals have female-only parental care. Male-only parental care is really common in fishes. So there are about 22,000 species of fishes around the world, and a surprising number of those species are actually going to exhibit male-only reproduction, parental care rather. And then of course you have biparental care, which is the situation with most birds, because even though you may invest a lot in the initial egg to get your offspring off to a good start, chances are that offspring is going to need a lot of parental care early on in order to grow and survive. So two aspects of survival of baby birds is, are you feeding them enough to support their growth to get them to fledging, and are you protecting them from predators adequately? So some other terminology that your book actually doesn't use, but it's from the ornithology literature. We have two types of bird babies: precocial and altricial. Precocial birds are birds that when they hatch out of the egg, they're relatively independent. So these would be things like ducks and geese and things like this, where shortly after they're hatched, they're walking around on land, they're jumping into the water and swimming around. Coots are this way as well. And altricial birds are these birds that when they hatch out, they just look like a skeleton with some skin and muscles on it, very few feathers, a big beak that is disproportionately large for their head. And they live in nests primarily, and they are not capable of taking care of themselves very well. These would be things like your robins, parrots, are a well-known group that are altricial. They basically hatch out at a much earlier developmental stage than precocial species do. And as a result, they require more parental care in order to get them to fledging.
Why is it common for fishes to be male only?
We'll discuss that later in the
Okay.
chapter. It has everything to do, well, there are a number of thoughts, but it's covered in the chapter later on. Jack, did you not read your chapter?
Maybe I didn't read that part.
Like, what I don't understand is the justification that like baby birds need more protection and food when they're born, and so like it's helpful for both parents to stay around, and why. I mean, that seems like it would be the case for all of the offspring. You know what I'm saying? Like if they got more
So-
protection and food, they'd be better off.
So it all comes down to what the relative costs and benefits are. So there's both a cost benefit analysis approach that they use in this chapter, as well as a game theoretical approach that they use for determining whether you're going to have no parental care, monoparental care, and whether that monoparental care will be done by the male or the female, and then whether biparental care is better. And so if you can get away with not caring for the offspring at all, you can generally have a higher reproductive rate if you can abandon your current reproductive effort as soon as possible. And so the question is it better for you to invest more in the current reproductive effort, or is it better to abandon that effort and leave those offspring to fend on their own and go on and reproduce again? And so it's kind of, what would be a good analogy? The old saying, putting all your eggs in one basket. You know, are you going to put all of your investment in this one reproductive effort, or are you going to spread that investment across multiple reproductive efforts? You should do whichever one of those is going to allow you to have the highest reproductive success. Now, if you spread your effort across multiple reproductive efforts, then probably a fewer proportion of each of those is going to survive, as opposed to putting all of your energy into one reproductive effort. Most of those will survive, but you don't get any reproductive efforts after that.
Are there any examples where, like, kind of like in humans, animals care for their offspring because they like get attached to them, like, you know, like they just actually physically care about them or mentally care about them? Do you know what I'm saying? Or is that just a human specific thing where
Do
it's
your
not
parents,
driven
do
by
your
like?
parents care about you, Alexis?
I mean, I think maybe, perhaps, less now that I'm home.
Yeah, so there have been some studies of emotion and attachment in non-human animals, but it's really difficult to get a handle on what a non-human animal is actually thinking. And so it's a little trickier to assign sort of emotional attachment to non-human animals. Now, so anytime you start talking about the behavior of humans, you start getting into squishy situations, because quite frankly, by the time you're about 5, you're an independent little human. And if you were in a hunter-gatherer culture, you know, by the time you're 4 or 5 or 6, you're out there hunting and gathering with the rest of the members of your social group, of your clan. And so the level of independence that you have in some cultures, even among humans, if you were going to do a comparative sociological study looking at hunter-gatherer cultures, hunter-gatherer cultures treat their offspring much differently than we do in the United States, because we provide an amazing amount of support for offspring long after they actually necessarily need it. And so, yeah, the whole culture thing becomes important in humans, and that's not as important in other organisms. Now, there are some cases where, for example, we've talked about scrub jays a couple of times now in the past in this class. They have an interesting situation where a mating pair will have offspring. Those offspring, when they reach fledging and could fly away and find a mate and start reproducing themselves, they actually stay at the nest and they help their parents raise the next brood of offspring. And those individuals may also stay and help the next brood of offspring. So you have these multi-generational families providing parental care. And the reason for this is that scrub jays generally, they live in an environment where it's very difficult for them to have successful reproduction when they're very young. And so they will spend 2 or 3 years after they've reached sexual maturity helping their parents raise their siblings before they fly off and then try and found their own nest, because nest failure when they're young is actually really high. And so I don't know about the emotions of animals very much, but certainly there are some animals that seem to express emotional attachment to offspring. The degree to which, though, that results in enhanced parental care for long periods of time, I think humans are probably the extreme example of that.
I had a question going back to the protection upon
Yeah.
birth. So I know in cattle, and I'm assuming bison too, whenever a calf is born, they release bovine colostrum, which has antibodies
Oh yeah.
and factors in it. Is that a form of protection for the young as well?
Yeah, I mean, and you get this from your mother also.
I'm assuming mammals do it. I mean,
yeah. So in this case, the cow actually eats it, right?
well, that's the afterbirth, but I'm talking about the legitimate milk that they.
Oh yeah. So you can get antibodies from the female parent in mammals through milk. You can get exposure to your parents, your mother's microbiome actually during the process of birth, because there's also this mixing of blood, and so yeah, you get a certain amount of your immunity, your early immunity, from being provisioned by the female.
Yeah, I know it's like an additional, like added protection by the mother, other than just like guarding their young. It's like
and I don't know that takes much, if any, more energy to produce than if they weren't doing that.
I think it's just in the first few days.
Yeah.
Upon birth. That's just what I know. I don't know much about it.
So, other questions about this stage of things? I suspected this chapter was going to go slower than the previous chapter, and I'm right. So what determines who cares and how much they care? So one constraint, or one way to think about this, is to think about constraints. When you look at a species and you look at its reproductive biology, its life history, etc., you can ask yourself, are there constraints that would point to one of the sexes being more likely to exhibit parental care and for a longer period of time? And so when we think about the physiology of mammals, the fact that females have mammary glands, that makes them the only member of the species that can provision the early offspring. That is a physiological and morphological constraint that basically says in mammals you're going to have primarily female parental care. And one of the ways to get a handle on this is to look at patterns of parental care across different groups of vertebrate animals, for example. And you can even look at this in insects if you want. But the example in your book looks at fishes, birds, and mammals to see how physiological and life history constraints affect what type of parental care is given and who provides it. So this is a book, this is a figure from your book, and it shows you that in invertebrates, parental care is uncommon, but when it does occur, it's mainly female only. Biparental care is uncommon, and male only care is even rarer. And that's generally because invertebrates are relatively short-lived. They produce tons and tons of offspring. Each offspring has relatively little chance of survival. And so they've taken their energy, they've divided it up into little tiny packets, and they've kind of flooded the market with it. And so invertebrates are in many cases thought to be a classic R-selected group of organisms.
Well,
Yeah.
I see that phrase life history used a lot, and I still
Oh,
am
yeah.
not quite sure what that implies.
Life history. So I actually took an entire course in graduate school on life history theory. As a matter of fact, I can never find books that I want when I want them, but I found this book for whatever reason. There's a classic little book by a guy named Stephen Stearns called The Evolution of Life Histories. So life histories is a general term that basically refers to a number of different things. One thing that it refers to is patterns of reproduction. How long does it take you to reach sexual maturity? When you reach sexual maturity, do you produce lots of offspring or relatively few offspring? How much total energy do you invest in reproduction as opposed to growth and maintenance? Are you a species that is simiparous, where you live your entire life and save up all of your energy, you reproduce once at the end and then you die? Or are you iteroparous, and so you reach maturity at a certain age and then you have lots of reproductive bouts throughout your adult life? Do you grow quickly to maturity and then produce a lot of offspring, or does it take you longer to reach maturity and then after that you produce fewer offspring that are bigger and you invest more in? How fast does your population grow as a result of all of these kinds of things? These are the kinds of questions that life history theory looks at, and these things are all correlated. Short-lived species tend to produce lots of tiny offspring. They tend to be small body sized. And also all these life history characteristics: age at first reproduction, body size, number of offspring, size of offspring, total amount of energy devoted to offspring. Those things all tend to be intercorrelated with one another because there are all of these kind of natural sort of energetic constraints that prevent a tiny organism from producing large offspring at all, because of just kind of physical energetic constraints. So when you see the term life histories, it's talking about all of that stuff. Does that help?
So it mostly has to do with with reproduction?
Yeah, so reproduction and growth. So one important aspect of life history theory is how long do you grow before you how long do you grow before you reach maturity, at which point you start reproducing. So think about the perfect organism. If you wanted to design an organism that would take over the world, what would that organism be like in terms of life history characteristics?
It would be iteroperative, so it could produce a ton of offspring.
So it would have iteroparity, so it would reproduce over and over again. What else would it be? If you were going to maximize reproduction, what would you want it to be when it was born?
Sexually mature.
Sexually
Yeah.
Sorry, a couple of people said things and I couldn't hear anyone.
Alexis was saying the same thing. Sexually mature.
Yeah, so it would be sexually mature at birth. Pops out of the womb or out of the egg and is ready to get going. What else? How many offspring would it produce?
An infinite number.
It would produce an infinite number of offspring. How big would those offspring be?
large?
And these offspring would be large. They would be precocial or altricial. Well, they would have to be precocial if they were sexually mature at birth. these are the life history characteristics of a species that would take over the world. It would become the supreme species on the planet in terms of its contribution to the total number of offspring on the planet. Guess what you don't see anywhere in the world?
This.
You don't see this organism. They don't occur because you can't do all of these things simultaneously. So the question is, you're born or you hatch. How long do you wait? How long does it take you to reach sexual maturity? After sexual maturity, do you reproduce immediately or do you wait for your first reproductive effort? Does that come after you reach sexual maturity or does it come immediately with the onset of sexual maturity? At that first reproduction, how many eggs or offspring do you have? Over time, does the number of offspring increase? Does it stay the same or does it decrease over time? And at what point do you reach post-reproductive age? And how long do you live after that? And all of these things, like I said, are intercorrelated, and all of the answers to those questions affect fundamentally population growth rate. So we can model population growth rate with simple equations where we just calculate what the intrinsic rate of increase is and then apply it to an equation. But there's another way in which you can project population growth rate using what are called life tables, where you have the age or the stage of development of growth of a species, and let's say that you have an organism that lives to be 80 years old, but the first 13 years, it hasn't reached sexual maturity. So from year 1 to year 2, year 2 to year 3, year 3 to year 4, the population of those individuals at those ages, the population size of those cohorts of the population are due mainly to survival from year to year. And then once they reach reproduction, there's still the aspect of survival from year to year, but because they're now reproductive, they're now putting offspring into the first age class. And then that age class survives. And so you can also model population by basically dividing up the lifespan of an organism, figuring out what the proportion of individuals is that survives from one age class to the next up until reproduction starts, and then looking at survival after reproduction starts from 1 year to the next, but then also looking at how those individuals put new individuals in the population through reproduction. And you can project population size that way also. So there are a variety of different ways of thinking about population growth rate. The thing about life tables and why some ecologists prefer to use life tables is because life tables include more of this kind of information in the projection of population growth. Once again, an exceedingly long answer to what seemed like a simple question.
No, it was really helpful though, because I feel like some of the literature I've read for the review and whatnot also talk about life history, and I was like, what?
Yeah, everything we're talking about in this chapter, especially, is all about life history.
Noted.
All right. Okay. So invertebrates, parental care is uncommon. Fish, strangely enough, there is a ratio of genera with male-only, biparental, and female-only care, where fish tend to have way more male parental care than female parental care, way more male-only is way more than biparental, which is way more than female-only. Amphibians, most of it is female-only care, but there's also some male-only care, relatively common, especially in some groups like the poison arrow frogs. Reptiles, reptiles either female alone, sometimes both parents, but mostly just female parental care. Once again, because they have internal fertilization, which is one of the aspects that controls this. and so the females carry the eggs with them after the male can desert. In birds, in 90% of the species, there's biparental care, but females often invest more in care. Females also do a lot of caring alone. Male-only parental care is relatively rare. And once again, we've already talked about mammals where females care in all species, and in 95% of species, females do monoparental care, and the male only helps in 5% of the cases. And there's no cases of male-only care because males are incapable on this front as mammals. So this begins to point to what some of the aspects of life history are, how these constraints affect things. The really interesting case is the situation with fish, where there's a lot more male-only monoparental care than you would expect based on other taxa. And so your book spends quite a lot of time talking about fish, actually. So the teleost fishes are the bony fishes. So any of the fish that you would typically think about eating fall into this category: perch, bass, catfish, etc. When you look at these groups, some of these fishes have internal fertilization, meaning the male sticks some intermittent organ into a female and transfers his sperm to the female. And then there's external fertilization, where the female will lay eggs, and then the male will spread sperm across those eggs. And as it turns out, the mode of fertilization affects whether or not a male exhibits parental care. So in internal fertilization, only 2 species of the ones in the study exhibited male parental care, but in external fertilization, we have 61 species exhibiting male parental care. Internal fertilization, you have 14 female species that do female parental care, and with external fertilization, it's 24, and a relatively small number of internal fertilization species have no parental care, but in external fertilization, there's 100 species that have no parental care. They deposit the eggs and then they just swim away from them. So one of the questions that your book asks is, why does the mode of fertilization influence how much parental care is expressed and who does the parental care? And there are some ideas that people have proposed for this. So because we have widespread external fertilization, most of the species exhibit external fertilization. Male parental care is more common. The question is why? One explanation is certainty of paternity, which we've mentioned before, but we're going to explore more today. The order in which gametes are released, and there's a hypothesis called the association hypothesis. So Trivers in 1972 put forward the idea that your certainty of paternity is determined to a certain degree by whether you are internally fertilizing the female or externally fertilizing the female's eggs. And so if external fertilization is occurring, you know that those eggs were fertilized by you because she squirted them out and then you squirted your sperm over them. And so whenever you have what they call simultaneous release of gametes, the female releases the gametes at the same time as the male, and so that male knows that those eggs are his. And as a result, he has a lot of interest in those eggs making it, because he knows with a high degree of certainty that those eggs are his. In internal fertilization, what does he not have in terms of certainty of paternity? Are you guys still with me?
Yes.
He can't be sure that there aren't other gametes from another male inside the
Yeah, and
female.
so there's no guarantee that she hasn't already mated with another male. There's no guarantee that she won't go and mate with another male after she leaves him. And so there's the possibility of sperm competition. And as a result, you have a lower certainty of paternity, and that means that you're less likely to want to exhibit or exert any parental care towards those offspring. And so you're more likely to provide parental care if you are more certain of paternity. And this is probably the best explanation for why this occurs. Also, the other thing that happens as you guard eggs as a male is it prevents another male from coming in and squirting his sperm over those eggs that have been placed in your nest. So I don't know if you guys, do any of you guys fish for like sunfishes and stuff here in the Midwest?
Sunfish, like bluegill?
Yeah. Yeah, like bluegill, crappie, things like that.
Yeah.
What?
They're pretty strong.
What?
They're pretty strong for a little fish.
Yeah, so what happens in sunfishes here in North America is the male will come in and he'll hollow out a little depression in a stream bed or a lake bed, and he will basically use his fins to basically clear this area out, get rid of all the sand, and when he gets rid of all the sand, there's like little pebbles along the bottom because he's basically swept all the small particles away. Oh, somebody's talking to somebody else. So then what he'll do is he'll basically set up shop here. He will try and attract a female. The female will come in. She will lay a bunch of eggs in his nest. He will then squirt his sperm over those eggs, and then he will guard those eggs in this nest while the female goes off and finds another male and squirts out some more eggs, and she's now maximizing her reproduction by mating with as many males as possible. Now, another male might try to swoop in here and squirt his sperm on these eggs also, hoping to steal some fertilization possibilities out of a nest that he didn't build and that he didn't exert any energy in attracting a female to. And in some species, the males and females of the fishes will actually be sexually dimorphic, such that the males will generally be larger bodied and more colorful, but you only get the large body and the color after you've reached a certain size. But younger males that have reached maturity but don't have size enough to maintain a territory will actually look like a female. They will sneak in, act like a female, pretend that they are a female who's going to squirt out a bunch of eggs into this male's nest. And when the male lets this male that looks like a female into his nest, he will actually just release his sperm onto the nest, and so he has now been cuckolded. So in some species, there's actually a sneaker male strategy that allows morphologically different adult males to behave like females and steal mating opportunities that way.
Wouldn't
Which is
that
kind
kind
of
of
clever.
counter the statement that external fertilization increases the reliability of paternity certainty?
Well, yeah, so those are relatively rare cases, but one of the reasons that you stick around and guard your eggs is to prevent other males from coming in and doing that. Now, there are different reproductive strategies within species that try and work around that sometimes. So, yeah, it's not perfect, but as soon as the male that's resident figures out that that male is not a female, even though he looks like a female, he does his best to chase that male out of there. But imagine what would happen to those eggs if he wasn't there guarding the eggs. I'm picturing you imagining. All right. Order of gamete release is all about who lets their gametes out first. And so with internal fertilization, males are the first to release their gametes, and as a result, they're free to defect, to escape, to desert the reproductive effort. This was an idea put forth by Dawkins and Carlisle in 1976. In external fertilization, the male must release eggs last, so the females are the first with the opportunity to escape, and so that might explain why most males, well, why more males exhibit parental care in fishes. But Davies, your textbook, rejects this idea for 2 lines of evidence. Do you guys recall what those are?
I think there was something about like with external fertilization, actually the gametes are kind of released at the same time.
Yes, in the vast majority of cases of external fertilization, they exhibit simultaneous release, and so the male doesn't release eggs first, or doesn't release eggs last, and so that would call into question that. What's the other explanation for why they don't think that this is a good explanation for male parental care in fishes? Do you recall the froth nest building fish?
Kind of, but I don't remember what the reasoning was there.
Yeah, there are groups of fishes that will build a nest that is made up of a protein that they kind of whip into a froth, and when they create this nest, they basically spread their sperm in the nest, so they release their gametes first, and then they try and entice females to come and lay the eggs in the nest, and then the eggs are fertilized in the nest, and they stick around and guard the eggs. And so even though they release their gametes first, they still end up being the ones that exhibit parental care, not the females. And so the order of gamete release is not a very compelling idea, at least in the eyes of Davies et al., the authors of your textbook, because of these 2 contradictory lines of evidence.
What were
And
the fish?
what's that?
What were the fish called?
I don't remember. I think it might not actually have the names, but if you look at the comments in the PowerPoint, if you have this open in PowerPoint, it describes what these 2 things are in the comment section. And I just don't remember what the name of those foam nesting fish are. It's a group of them. Yeah, 2 families, which I'm not even going to try and pronounce the names of the families. So this is, I'm looking at it on my Kindle, so I'm not sure what page it's in, but there's a little paragraph in there, and it talks about these foam nest building species. They release the sperm before the female lays the eggs. In this case, the opportunity for desertion predicts that males can desert first, but nevertheless, parental care is provided by the male. Therefore, male parental care remains correlated with external fertilization, independent of the order of gamete release or opportunity to desert. So they're like poo-poo on that idea.
So is Davies just rejecting external or both internal and external?
No, he's rejecting that the order of gamete release is a good explanation for why males provide parental care more often in fishes.
Okay, thanks.
So then there's the association hypothesis, and this idea is that association with embryos affects the decision to desert. In internal fertilization, females have more association with embryos, therefore they will provide more parental care. That correlates with the data that are in that table earlier. And because males guard a territory to attract future females, they are also more associated with the embryos. And so in those cases, they may tend to apply more parental care. Another thing that happens with males in these males that guard his territory, create a nest for the female to come in and lay eggs, is oftentimes fish females express a choice for males, and they base their choice of whether they're going to mate with a male on the basis of whether or not there are any eggs in the nest already. And so in a lot of species of fishes, you are much more likely to attract a female fish to your nest if your nest already has a supply of eggs. And it's just basically this idea in the mind of a female fish, oh, that male has been successful at attracting other females. That male must be of high quality. I'm going to add my eggs to the eggs that are already there. And so there's also fitness benefits of males guarding a territory. to attract future females. And as a result, they become more associated with the embryos, and that makes them more likely to provide parental care. So nest guarding behavior is kind of a pre-adaptation to parental care. It's one of these kind of necessary preconditions for parental care to develop in males in fishes.
Dr. Kornsky.
Yeah.
I don't mean to be rude, but it is 1:41.
Oh my gosh. No, you're not rude at all. I'm just talking about fish sex and lost track of time. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, we'll stop here and we'll pick up with this on Friday. Thanks for that. Unfortunately, I can't see a clock on my screen when I'm in Zoom. So thank you for that reminder, and I'll see you on Friday.
Perfect. I just wasn't sure if like you wanted to get some point like finished, or if you just didn't know. So I just
No. We're going to be talking about sex for the next week and a half.
Okay.
So,
Cool.
all right. I'll see you guys on Friday. Yeah. You have a question?
Yeah, this is just personal. Did you happen to get my email?
I did. I told you weren't on yet. I've got a backlog of emails from you guys. I'm working on grading some things for my applied stats. As soon as I'm done with that, I'm going to get to answering emails from you guys in animal behavior.
Okay. Yeah, it's just about the review. So.
Yep, it's on my plate. I'm aware of it.
Okay. Cool. Thank you.
Right.
Hey,
Okay.
Paul.
Yeah.